So let's wrap up our knowledge by learning one final last project. This last project will contain a for loop. We'll be working with the this keyword, and we'll be working with different aspects of the DOM. So this will take our knowledge that we have learned so far and put it into some practical use. So here's my index.html example. And what we have is the background color, so that we can choose red, green, and blue. By default it's red, but I can go ahead and change that. I can also change the default width, and you'll notice as soon as I'm changing the values on these select drop downs, it's immediately triggering an event, and that event takes care of what happens to this div element. Likewise, we can just start playing around with the height as well. So you can play around with all of these values and just get different results. So now let's go ahead and take a look at this project's directory. So if we take a look at this directory, we have an index.html file and a script.js file that's loaded into our index file. Let's first of all take a look at this index.html file, and then we'll move swiftly on to the JavaScript. So firstly, we have some spans right here. They just contain some text for the input. So it will tell the user, all right, this is background color, width, and height, and so forth. Next, you have your select drop downs. So with the selects, you have multiple options. For the background color, you have red, green, blue. And for the width and the height, you have the values of either 100, 200, or 300 pixels. And then you'll notice down here I have a couple of line breaks, and that's just to make sure that this div element right here just goes down onto a new line and just breaks things up a little bit. And then we have the all-important content div. So this is a div element with an ID, so we can target it nice and easy. And we have the style attribute applied, and it has the default values. So the default values are the first options in every select dropdown. So the first option is the background color of red. That's the default, so I say background red. Width 100 pixels. There you go. And height 100 pixels. So there you go. You have all of these drop downs, and that will modify the CSS of a div element. Now, last but not least, when the DOM has finished rendering all of these elements, we then want to load up our JavaScript file. So we load up our script.js file. Let's take a look at this file right now. So we first of all have a variable that is going to contain an array of virtual DOM objects. So we have the name array select. So I'm being very literal with my naming here. You can give it whatever name you like. But what is it? Well, we are going to fetch out all of the select elements. So I'm saying document.get elements by tag name. Now this method looks for all of those tags. So we have 3 select drop-down elements, and therefore there will be 3 virtual DOM objects returned in an array. So they'll all be placed in the array. If you wanted a more detailed view, let's look at this variable right here. I'll say inspect element, and then I'll say array select, and you'll notice it has 1, 2, and 3. So they are the 3 virtual DOM objects, all in an array. And if you wanted to be more explicit, say array select, and now you'll notice here is my object right here, 0, 1, 2. That's an array. We have the background select, we have the width and the height, and you can see they're all again virtual DOM objects. They contain all the information about each DOM element. So now we have our array of virtual DOM objects for all of our select dropdowns. The next thing I want to do is take a look at iterating through each one of the virtual DOM objects, or those objects that resemble those DOM elements. And for each one, I want to add an event listener. I'm going to add the event listener of change, which means the value of that input changed. And the very next parameter we define is the function. So the function that I'm going to attach is the drop-down styles function, and that function will end up changing the styles on our div element. So let's take a closer look at this for loop. We have a counter, which is simply a variable that starts at 0. Then we have the condition, which I must be less than arraySelect.length. And then every time we execute this context, we add 1, we increment I. So now what we need to do is discover what's happening here. Well, we know that we have an array, and that array will tell us how many elements it has by the length property. So if we take a look at this array again, so I can say dir array select, and we take a look at this array, we have 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, and you can see it being highlighted up here. If you notice, I hover over it, and the length property will produce the value of 3 in this case. So array select length will return 3, and on the first iteration of this loop, I is equal to 0. That's where we start from. I is equal to 0, no problem. And this will select the first element in our array, 0, right here, which if I hover over it, you can see that is the background select. And then we're saying add an event listener, add the event change, and if the value changes, aka if I select something new, then trigger the drop-down styles function. Likewise, we go again, we iterate through, that's one execution, so now I is equal to 1. Perfect, that's not a problem. Is I, which is equal to 1, less than 3? Yes, execute. Now we're selecting the element with the index of 1, which is that next width select dropdown. And we're adding that exact same event listener and callback function onto this element. Then we run through again. So once it's executed, I is now equal to 2. Is 2 less than 3? Yes. Array select is now 2. Go target that element, which is the height dropdown. And again, we are adding an event listener, the same event, and the same callback function. That's very easy. So now I'm just going to set everything back to the way it was. So now we know the process, and so all this for loop is doing is simply iterating through all of the elements in the array and adding an event listener. That's all it's doing. Now also notice that I'm not adding in the opening and closing brackets because you don't want to execute your function when you're adding the event listener. That's a big mistake. All you want to do is type in the name of the function that you want to add as a callback. That's very, very important because otherwise when it actually adds the event listener, it will automatically run that function straight away, which may have undesired results. So just get rid of those opening and closing brackets. Make sure you're not executing that function unintentionally. And also I want to just add this back in here, array select.length. Now we know that this function is being executed on all of our select dropdowns whenever the value is changed. So whenever I change that value, that function is firing. And that same function is dealing with all of these dropdowns, whether it be the color, whether it be the width, or whether it be the height. It doesn't really matter. All of that same function is being executed on every single dropdown. Now this function has two variables right here, one called style and the other one called value. Now both of these variables are targeting the this keyword. So in order to find out what this is, we have to look at the context. And how do we do that? We look at how this function was invoked. This function was invoked via an event listener. And we know that in JavaScript, if we have an event listener that invokes a function, it generates a virtual DOM object that populates the this keyword. So for example, let's go ahead and pick one of our select dropdowns. Don't forget, all of those select dropdowns have exactly the same function that is attached to them, and whenever their value changes, that function is invoked. So I'm just going to pick the width dropdown and change the value. Well, when we do that, then our execution context is invoked. And if we review that, this keyword, you'll find out that it contains the virtual DOM object of that element that the event was fired on. So for example, as I changed the value of the width dropdown, what it did was it generated an object that gives us all the information about that specific element that the event was fired on. And then that object is passed to the this keyword. So we know what this object is. So as I have just invoked that event on the width dropdown, we can look at the ID of this particular object. So we're looking actually at the ID attribute of the DOM element, which in my case, if we scroll down and find the ID, it contains the string width. Then also in the second variable, value, it says this.value. Now with your input DOM elements, they have values. The value attribute tells you what value the user has inputted, or in our case, selected. So let's take a look at the value property and see what it came out as. It said 200 pixels. Notice right there, 200 pixels. That is the value of that select dropdown. So now we have the ID, which the ID, by the way, is the same as the CSS property name that we want to affect. We want to affect the width property, and you'll notice it's all lowercase, and the value. So we have the CSS property name via the element's ID and the value that we want to set the CSS property to, which in our case, we're going to set it to 200 pixels. So now that we have both of these two pieces of information, we now want to target our main div element, which I've targeted it via this element variable and said document.getElement by ID and get the element with the ID of content. So now we are targeting an object via this variable that is effectively targeting this div element right here. And we want to modify the style attribute, and we want to start changing some of these CSS properties. So what I want to do is target the element. So we're targeting it right there. And then we're targeting the style object. So that embedded style object with all of those different CSS properties. And then in square brackets, which means I want to dynamically fetch a key, I want to go grab the value stored within the style variable. So in my case, it's targeting that style variable, which points to the ID attribute, which in my case, that is the width string. So immediately we have the CSS property that we want to change. Next up, we have the value. So we're targeting that property, that CSS property, if you will, and we're saying equals, and we're assigning a value. And that value in my case was 200 pixels. Nice and easy. So now that we have this information, it just simply inserts that information. It changes the style attribute right here. And it changed the width CSS property to 200 pixels. Likewise, the same process happens over here. A virtual DOM element is created, targeting the element that the event was fired on. It has an ID on here, which is height. That's a CSS property. And it also has a value, which is 200 pixels. Then again, it targets that same div element. It targets that same CSS property, and it changes that CSS property's value within the style attribute. And again, the same goes for the background color. So we found a really good use for the this keyword. And we've also understood that by using the DOM attributes, such as the ID, so height, width, and background, we are actually using the values of these attributes, and that value right there, that ID, will allow us to target a specific CSS property. So thanks to this keyword, I can just create one function and then work with the context of that function, which is the object that resembles the DOM element that the event was fired on. Now also, why did I create a variable called element? Why didn't I just do document.getElementById, this is perfectly valid JavaScript, .style, and then modify that particular style? Well, the reason why I didn't do that is because searching through the document object can be an expensive process. So when we say an expensive process, it usually means it takes quite a bit of time. Now, document.getElementById is very fast, don't get me wrong. It pulls out the object within milliseconds. And there's 1,000 milliseconds in a second, so the time isn't that great. And the user is never going to notice those milliseconds. Now, the only time they will notice it is if, let's say, you're animating your DOM elements and you normally animate the style CSS properties. For example, you can animate the margin, for example, and make it look like the object is moving or the DOM element is moving. Well, okay, but if you did this every time you wanted to execute this context, it would actually be a very expensive process and it would slow your animation down greatly. So the best thing to do is to create a variable right here and then do one search operation, meaning search through the entire document object, which could contain thousands of objects depending on how many DOM elements you have, and then just performing that search once, and then we can point to it via this variable. So we're only performing that search once, and then we can just target this variable, and that eliminates a lot of the overhead. It makes things a lot quicker. Now, with this function, to be honest with you, even though, yes, it's classed as an expensive process, it's not really. It's very quick. But when it comes to, let's say, animating and doing other things, you should always try to target and perform that search operation once, and then work with those objects, or object in our case, via a simple variable, a simple pointer. But in our case, to be honest with you, we didn't need to do this because it's not being executed that many times. The user is not that quick. I mean, even if the user was absolutely astoundingly quick, JavaScript would handle that no problem. That wouldn't be an issue. But I just put that in there just to help you out if you find that trying to do, let's say, animations and other things like that in JavaScript, the reason why it may be going slow is because you're performing a lot of search operations on the document object, and that is what slows things down a lot in JavaScript. So that's why I did the search operation once and then targeted the element. So there is our final project. I hope you've learnt a lot and I hope you've had fun.